Human conflict has changed throughout history, from pitched battles to the use of mass bombing campaigns. But one constant has been the development of new and often cruel ways of killing the opposing soldier. In this new video series, we shall be looking at some of the most disturbing weapons of war. And we will be starting things off with the chemical weapons of the First World War. It was during this war to end all wars that chemical weapons were first developed and used by all sides in an attempt to break the stalemate of the trench warfare, and to avoid the attrition warfare where thousands of lives were spent to claim little ground. The mere thought of the First World War conjures images of smoke-filled battlefields, of gas masks, and of soldiers debilitated by one of the most feared weapons of war. In the years preceding the Great War, a number of the world powers, including Germany, Britain and France, were signatories of the Hague Convention of 1899 and 1907. Part of the conditions of this treaty was to ban the use of poisonous weapons, which many feared would prove catastrophic. However, the wording was somewhat confused, and resulted in interpretations as to just exactly what was banned. In addition, not every country signed the treaty, notably the United States, Italy, and the Ottoman Empire. It was not long into the First World War that the first chemical weapons were deployed. It was the French who would use tear gas against the German forces as a means to incapacitate. It was deployed through the use of grenades and was designed to force soldiers to flee and break ranks. Whilst tear gas results in the burning of eyes and respiratory discomfort, it was not a lethal weapon and was one that was widely viewed as permitted by the Hague Conventions. Its deployment, however, did lead to the German military developing their own tear gas, using methylbenzyl bromide. In August of 1914, during the Battle of Belimov, around 18,000 of the gas shells were deployed against Russian positions, although this had little effect. The gas was rendered useless in the cold winter weather, as it would just harmlessly fall to the ground. German scientists would therefore develop a more effective gas, settling on chlorine gas. Chlorine was a byproduct of many industrial dye factories. As a gas, it causes extreme irritation to the eyes, nose, throat, and lungs of those who are exposed. After a prolonged exposure to this gas, a person will die a painful death from asphyxiation. The German army had previously attempted to deploy a similar chlorosulfate gas against the British at Neuve-Chapelle. Although this failed as the chemical was incinerated by the explosive charges of the shells, meaning the gas had no effect. This was avoided on the 22nd of April 1915, when pressurized canisters containing around 150 tons of chlorine gas were deployed against French and colonial Algerian forces at Ypres. The French forces first saw a green cloud of smoke, and believing it was a smokescreen for an imminent attack, were ordered to the firing steps of the trenches. As the gas reached them, the French forces were routed and fled the gas, not knowing that running through the gas would only make the injuries worse. The Germans were stunned at the effectiveness of this gas, but they were not prepared to advance through the murderous cloud after seeing its deadly effect. In response, researchers soon found that there were ways to mitigate the effects of the gas. This would include keeping to high ground where possible, and using urine-soaked fabric to cover the mouth and nose, as the ammonia would neutralize the chlorine. Whilst they first issued a formal condemnation of the use of chlorine, the British, French and Russian forces nevertheless developed their own special gas companies to deploy their own gas. Though chlorine gas proved to be at times an ineffective weapon, easily affected by the wind, it soon became a weapon that the soldiers in the trenches would rightly fear. The British Army learned this the hard way in September of 1915, when around 150 tons of chlorine gas was deployed against the German trenches. The gas blew back towards the British lines with some 2,000 casualties inflicted as a result. The next major breakthrough in the chemical gas arms race was the development of phosgene gas. Phosgene is a colourless gas that has a subtle smell of mouldy hay, meaning that it was much harder to detect than chlorine. It was also much more deadly and had a delayed effect on the victim, often taking a day or two for a person to die. The gas results in the lungs filling with liquid, meaning the afflicted would suffocate to death in agonizing pain. Phosgene gas was the preferred chemical agent employed by the British and French, though it was first deployed by the German forces. It was by far the deadliest of the gases used during World War I, responsible for 85% of the chemical weapon-related deaths. In many instances, phosgene was mixed with chlorine gas to increase its effectiveness. But by 1917, gas masks became a standard piece of equipment for the frontline soldiers, which would render the gas largely ineffective. Gas would again become a major threat in July of 1917, when the German army deployed mustard gas, perhaps the most infamous of the chemical weapons deployed during the First World War. Mustard gas is sulfur-based and a potent blistering agent. It is similar to phosgene, in that its effects are not seen right away, but it does have a distinct smell, described as garlic, rubber, or dead horses. After a few hours following exposure, the victim's eyes will start to water and get incredibly painful, before becoming temporarily blind. In addition, the affected skin will start to blister and burn, usually starting in the groin and armpits. These blisters would eventually burst, posing a risk of secondary infection. The gas would affect the lungs, causing internal bleeding and asphyxiation. Once affected, any second or third exposure to the gas would produce more severe reactions. It would often take months for a soldier affected to recover from exposure to mustard gas. Unlike the other gases that would disperse into the air, mustard gas would sink as an oily substance that would coat the affected area. This would result in great stretches of land being contaminated and left inhospitable for months. Whilst it was a hugely painful and demoralizing gas that caused a great deal of casualties, it did not cause many direct death, as in the open air, the concentration of the lethal dose was not often reached. The effects of chemical gas during World War I were profound. Around 1.3 million people were affected, and around 3% of that figure died as a result of exposure. But many more were left debilitated by the gas. Around 5% were left with permanent illnesses such as blindness or respiratory damage. There is also evidence to suggest that exposure to mustard gas could lead to skin cancers, leukemia, and severe eye conditions. For the general public, most were unaffected directly by the gas, though there were many reported instances of gas reaching civilian populations. It is thought that around 100,000 civilians were affected by gas attacks, as what we would now call collateral damage. These risks were well known to all sides of the conflict, with the British Field Marshal Sir Douglas Haig even writing in his diary, "My officers and I were aware that such weapons would cause harm to women and children living in nearby towns, as strong winds were common on the battlefront. However, because the weapon was directly against the enemy, none of us were overly concerned at all." Many more civilians, however, would be greeted with the effects of the chemical weapons, when soldiers would return home blistered, blind and broken by their exposure to the horrendous weapons. Though, the First World War was not the last use of these chemical weapons. The British had developed M-devices, a new deployment method that was used against the Red Army in 1919. They were dropped from planes as a means to incapacitate the Bolshevik forces. In 1925, the Geneva Convention was signed to prohibit the use of chemical weapons, although despite this, many armies and countries still deployed gases such as tear gas against civilian populations. In the 1930s, Fascist Italy deployed chemical weapons against the under-equipped Abyssinian forces, which we do have a video on if you would like to see more. The link will be in the description. The tale of the use of chemical gas also includes the interesting case of Franz Haber, a talented German chemist. He was the son of a dyestuff manufacturer, meaning he was well aware of the abundance and effects of chlorine. In 1908, Haber was responsible for one of the greatest chemical discoveries of the 20th century. He discovered the process of converting atmospheric nitrogen to ammonia, greatly improving access to fertilizer. But, as is often the case, scientific development and genius can be used in warfare. Haber was eager to develop and promote the use of chemical weapons, and arguably the man most responsible for the chemical arms race. It was Haber who put forward the idea of releasing chlorine gas from cylinders which would be blown to enemy positions. It is hard to separate the horrors of the First World War and chemical weapons. The use of such weapons can perhaps be best seen as an example of the callous nature of those who ordered their deployment, or just as a way to finally bring an end to a costly bloody war by any means necessary. One would hope that the lessons of the First World War would mean the end of such weapons. Yet, this does not seem to be the case. For those who wish to read more, links will be in the description, as well as poems and accounts from those affected by the gas attacks that defined and scarred a generation.